Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, the most important knife making tool you'll ever make. So over here behind me is the most important tool that I ever made. Now, it doesn't look like much, does it? I mean, it almost doesn't look like a tool at all. Is it the most important tool for you? Nope. Hang with me to the end because I'm going to come back and tell you more about that one, and maybe you'll see why I'm so high on it. But anyway, what I want to do today is talk about making your own tools. So spread out in front of me here are a whole bunch of little tools and gizmos that I've made over the years. And basically all we're going to do today is take a tour of all these little tools and see some of the things that I've made. You may see some of these and they may inspire you and you may want to make them for yourself, or you may not. But as we wander through these tools, I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges, the benefits, the pleasures even of making your own tools, and also, frankly, why sometimes it's a little bit self-indulgent. Okay, I'm going to start with this. It's one of the most specific and one of the fanciest tools I've made. The point of it is to allow me to measure the lock faces of liner lock folder knives that I make. There's a similar gizmo out there that somebody made up for measuring lock back folder parts, and I kind of adapted it to this purpose. Basically, you've got a dial indicator that measures to the 10,000ths of an inch. Why a tenths instead of a thou indicator? Because folder locks are very tricky little suckers, and if you don't measure them pretty precisely, they just won't work right. That's the reason for this thing in the first place, and kind of the reason that I stopped making them. I was hoping this gizmo would solve the problems of getting locks tuned. It didn't. It took quite a bit of work to design it and make it on my CNC machine, and when it was done, it just didn't really solve the problems I was having. It helped, but didn't quite get me there. So, lesson here, sometimes you make a pretty nice tool and it just does bupkis for you. Now let's take a look at some much less fancy tools. Look, I haven't always had a CNC machine or a mill. Back when I got started, I had nothing. I mean, truly nothing. So these two little forms were intended for making a pair of Japanese sword fittings called a fuchi and a kashira. The fuchi is made by using a punch tool to hammer a flat piece of copper into a die and form it into sort of a dome shape. The kashira, on the other hand, is hammered around this little anvil and soldered together. Now the fittings look pretty similar, but they're made in completely different ways. Like I said, these two fixtures were made way before my milling days, and so they were all about filing and drilling with some help from a belt grinder. I should add that 20-odd years ago, I actually made even more primitive versions out of wood. Guess what? They work just fine. Lesson here, just because a tool looks fancy does not mean it's useful, and vice versa. Here are a couple more Japanese sword fitting tools from roughly that era of my career. This tool and die set was for shearing out seppa blanks. Seppas are the little washers that sandwich Japanese sword guards, and the other half of the task for busting out the hole in the middle of the seppa that the tang passes through. Again, no machining, just files, drills, a hand tap, and some heat treating. More Japanese tools. These are chisels known as sainomi or scabbard chisels, used for making scabbards and handles for Japanese swords. The key difference between these and standard chisels are that they have a bent handle and additionally they have a rounded belly. Unbelievably useful for reasons I won't get into here. This is the first one I ever made. Now, I'd seen them in books about Japanese sword making, but couldn't find one to buy, so I just forged one myself. As is typical for me, I often slap together a prototype of something to see if it'll work. You can see how primitive the handle is here. I basically just whittled it. Then, it turns out the thing works great, and 20 years later, I'm still using this awful looking prototype, and I've never made the fancy version. So speaking of that, I get requests every few months to make these scabbard chisels because they're pretty hard to find. And I'm finally gonna make a batch of them. Way, way, way more attractive than the ones I'm showing here, of course, but functionally no different. So if you've been hankering for a Cyanomi, I'll have them for sale on WalterSorrellsBlades.com in the next few weeks. This is kind of cool. It's a tool to help me grind the belly on the Saya chisels. Adjustable so I can grind different radii. Don't yet know if this is a hit or a miss. I'll find out next week when I make this big batch of Saya chisels. Another fun one, a Japanese style hand plane I made for planing the interior curves of scabbards. Here's an old Japanese made plane, flat bottom, the same idea, different application. So quick note, if you're a fan of the channel, do us a solid and help support us on Patreon. As a thanks for your support, you'll have free access to plans for most of my knife builds, as well as for lots of these little gizmos that I'll be showing you in the video today. Now, if you've been enjoying the free content here from me for, believe it or not, 12 years, now is your chance to give back. So link in the cards and description, patreon.com/Walter Sorrells. All right, let's get back to work. Here, something totally different. It's a blade straightener. The idea is that you have a 3-point contact for bending, 2 on the ends, 1 in the middle, and a long handle that gives you a bunch of leverage. The studs with the contact points are movable so you can attack short or long bends with the same gizmo. I mostly make differentially hardened blades which respond really well to this straightening approach. I adapted this from a similar tool used by shotgun makers for barrel straightening. Saw it in a video about bespoke English shotgun makers, I don't know, Holland, Purdy, somebody like that, and I basically just adapted the design from that. Lesson here, there are gazillions of obscure tools out there that have some narrow use in some realm outside knife making. Never be afraid to steal a good idea. This basic idea has probably been used in making guns for hundreds of years, so no guilt on my part adapting this into knife making. By contrast, a couple of pretty standard tools, one a file guide for filing the junction between tangs and ricassos, and the other a center scribe. Now, both of these are pretty crude. You can buy commercial versions of these that are much better. All of them, commercial versions, include some carbide pieces for wear resistance that would make them hard to make in your home shop. The question on this sort of thing is make or buy. Now, my theory is always buy it if you can afford it, make it if you can't. But, you know, there's really no right answer, which leads me to a little excursion into the issue of self-indulgence. There are some tools that I've made that, you know, I could afford to buy, but I made them anyway. So why? Well, honestly, because it was interesting to me. I'll freely admit that this is basically just self-indulgence. So let me give you a little insight into the artistic personality if that's not you. I mean, honestly, if you aren't a little self-indulgent, you probably will suck as an artist. You know, the world's always going to tell you, and they're right, that you're better off being a welder or an accountant or something like that. It's just a much simpler way of living. To me, the main thing is just to be honest about it. Look, if you do this as a hobby, then the whole thing's intended to be fun, so there's no right or wrong way to do it. Just make whatever you feel like. On the other hand, if you're supporting yourself with this, obviously it's a different equation. This tool is a scraper designed for scraping out fullers, or bohees as they're known in Japanese. I adapted this from something that my friend Jesus Hernandez came up with, and he adapted it from somebody else, and that was in a way sort of adapted from traditional Japanese versions that aren't as adjustable as this. And this is a companion that's made for sanding out the bohees that are scraped out by the previous tool. Both of these tools are adjustable so that you can scrape out bohea of different radii and sand them out and get them nice and clean and polished. Okay, so once you get into machining, the line between tooling and gizmos and fixtures and the thing you're actually starting to make, well, it all kind of blurs together. Now, I've made tons of these little things right here, subas, over the years. These are Japanese sword guards. You know, I've forged them and filed them out of antique wrought iron in ways that really don't differ too much from the ways that they would have done them hundreds of years ago. I've ground them on belt grinders from, say, homemade Damascus steel or some kind of more modern material. I've used Dremels, I've milled them manually, and I've made them on those things back there, CNC machines. This little fixture is made for CNC machining subas. The biggest pain in the neck when making these things is the little hole known as a nakagoana that goes through the center. I used to drill several holes, then cut away the extra with a jeweler's saw, then file them to their final shape with custom files that were modified just for this job, and little tiny hobby files, 100% handwork, and it took hours and hours and hours. I consider this to be a giant waste of time. Look, everybody's got their own philosophy on this. Some people find, Zen-like pleasure in doing rote, dull manual work. I do not. In my opinion, there's nothing ennobling about dumping huge amounts of your life into painful, boring, stupid work. Honest folks can disagree on this point here, but now I take a blank, slap it in here, and the CNC machine does the idiot work. Making this fixture took a ton of work, and it was a lot of fun. It was interesting. It took a lot of thinking. And once it's done, I can allocate my time toward the artistic part of making subas. The design part, the material choice part, all that stuff. The part that makes this an interesting job. And I leave the dumb part to the machine. I'm glad that in my early days I learned to do it the hard way, and I'm equally glad that I do not do it like that anymore. Okay, I'll wrap up with this tool. The one that I introduced at the beginning, which I came up with over 20 years ago. Like I said earlier, you could barely even call it a tool. It's used for polishing Japanese swords. Now, traditionally, Japanese sword polishing was done exclusively with abrasive stones, and actually I still use them for the foundation polishing and the shaping. But for the final part of the polish, I use a modern approach and I turn to sandpaper. The idea here is simple. I'm stretching a piece of sandpaper over a sort of platen and then doing pretty much the same thing that most custom makers do with a sanding block. I'm just moving the blade rather than the sanding block. Why do it this way? Well, two reasons. First, it's a lot harder to accurately move a sanding block down the face of a 3-foot blade, but more importantly, it's just a more efficient use of the abrasives on your sandpaper. A lot of the time that you spend when you're doing hand sanding is just messing around with the sandpaper. So by moving the blade constantly to a section of unused sandpaper, you use fresh abrasives on every single stroke, and you don't have to spend much time farting around with the sandpaper. Also, concentrating on this tiny area of paper, you work faster and you use up less sandpaper. I mean, it seems kind of silly, but I've spent more hours using this tool by several orders of magnitude than any other tool that I've designed. I've just finished this workbench, so I'm about to make a fancier, upgraded version of this particular one that you're looking at here, which I really just improvised for the video, but the basic idea won't change. Now, with only a couple of exceptions, Japanese woodworking tools, little scribes and files and, file guides and stuff like that, most of the tools were created the same way. Basically, I ran into some kind of problem. Something was just irritating the crap out of me, and somewhere along the way, that irritation kind of came into focus, and I said, hey, I got to do something about this. And that's where I got working on a tool. So what's the overall lesson here? Every knife maker does different work, and as a result, we all run into slightly different problems. So the best tool for you is inevitably going to be different from the best tool for me. The one that really revolutionizes what I do is different from the one that's going to be a game changer for you. So if you haven't found it yet, it's out there waiting for you. All you have to do is go out and find it. Make it. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. WalterSorrellsBlades.com.